At 2:25 p.m. on the 30th of March 1835, Lucinda Sly, a 57-year-old Carlow woman, was taken from her cell in the county jail to begin the short walk to the gallows that awaited outside, as the executioner placed a noose around her neck, and she took her final glance of this mortal realm. The events of the previous months that led to this terrifying moment raced through her mind. She thought of her young lover, John Dempsey, whose feet she could hear shuffling behind, as he too felt the hangman's rope tighten around his neck. She thought of the years of abuse she had suffered at the hands of her brutish husband, Walter Sly. She thought of the bullet that had passed through his skull, freeing her from his tyranny, and how quickly her hopes of a happy life with John had slipped from her grasp. Outside the prison, a crowd of 10,000 people jostled for position as they bayed for her blood. Lucinda Sly, despite her suffering, had become a figure of hate in the eyes of many of those who gathered to watch her demise. She had betrayed her vows of marriage, and she had betrayed her Protestant faith by taking a young Catholic lover, and was responsible not only for the death of her husband, but also the impending hanging of 27-year-old John Dempsey, whom she had led so far from the path of righteousness. As the clock struck 2:30 p.m, Lucinda and John walked out onto the gallows together as the crowd mocked and jeered. The hangman inspected the rope around their necks, raised his arm and pulled a lever, and together the ill-fated couple were launched into eternity. What follows is the story of the unfortunate life and death of Lucinda Sly, her marriage to a violent drunkard, her desperate bid for freedom with her illicit lover, and her conviction for murder that led to an execution so brutal that she became the last woman to ever be publicly hanged in the county of Carlow. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story. These videos take weeks to research, write, film on location, narrate and edit. Your likes, comments and shares help to get the attention of YouTube and encourages them to share the video with a wider audience. About 57 years before the terrible series of events that led to the infamous hanging outside Carlow jail, a baby girl named Lucinda was born into the respectable Hughes family who lived on the banks of the River Slaney in the town of Tullow in County Carlow. The year was 1778, and although not rich by any means, Lucinda's father did own his own farmland, and as such the Hughes family were considerably better off than many of their neighbours. In her mid-20s, a young local man named Thomas Singleton, who had recently inherited a farm of his own just outside the small town, caught Lucinda's eye, and the couple soon began making plans to spend their life together. To Lucinda's parents, it seemed like the perfect match. Not only was Thomas a landowner, but he was also a Protestant, as were the Hughes, and soon the couple were married. Lucinda was a hard-working and tenacious young woman who could often be found working with Thomas in the fields, churning butter in the dairy, or baking bread in the kitchen. And when their first child arrived, a boy also named Thomas, it seemed like their life was set for success. That was until one evening when Thomas Sr. developed a cough that he just could not seem to shake. Over the next few weeks, his condition worsened. The formerly fit and healthy farmer became weak and thin, and the rags he held over his mouth as he coughed became stained with blood. Thomas lingered for a few weeks as Lucinda helplessly watched him fade from her grasp, and the dreaded consumption took another victim to her premature grave. Now a widow in her late 20s, Lucinda found herself with a farm to run and a young son to raise, all on her own. Over the years that followed, she worked the land as best she could and supplemented her income by selling butter and bread to neighbours in Tullow and on fair days around the county. She dedicated her time and energy to providing for Thomas, and as the years slipped by, she grew increasingly weary and lonely. When Thomas reached his teenage years, his relationship with his mother became strained. One day, much to his mother's dismay, he left the farm to find his own way in life and did not think to look back. Lucinda was now completely alone. Without the help of her son, it became increasingly difficult to grow food on the farm, and Lucinda relied heavily on the income she earned from selling bread and butter. As she carried her wares along the green lanes of Carlow, to and from town and fairs, she dreamt of meeting somebody to share her life with. The strain of years of labour and stress had not eroded Lucinda's looks. She was now in her mid-40s, and her beauty had been noticed by a few suitors, but Lucinda was not going to settle for just anyone. She still owned her own farm, and any potential husband would have to be of a similar standing, and of course of the Protestant faith. As Fair Day in Carlow town approached, Lucinda set about baking in the hopes that she could earn some extra money selling to inebriated farmers who had brought their livestock to market and had money burning a hole in their pockets. About 25 kilometres from Tullow, across the rolling green fields of Carlow and the great River Barrow, lies a small village named O'Loughlin, a short distance outside of which one Mr. Walter Sly owned a substantial farm in an area known as the Ridge. Walter was a well-off man whose income from farming and the several tenants he rented land to allowed him to deal in fine horses. Walter was a single man who, like Lucinda, was now in his mid-40s, and his thoughts had increasingly turned to finding himself a wife. Everyone who knew Walter also knew of his short temper and gruff personality, both of which became significantly more foul when he partook in his favourite hobby, drinking whiskey, which likely explains why he had not yet married. Many in the community harboured ill feeling towards Walter, particularly the Catholic tenants he had evicted from their homes during a dispute over rent, and on several occasions his drunken temper led him to brawl with anyone who got in his way. As Fair Day in Carlow approached, Walter decided to take some livestock into town. He cleaned himself up, gathered the cattle he wished to sell, and set out in the direction of Carlow town. Carlow was a hive of activity on fair days. Its streets bustled with hopeful farmers, travelling hawkers, and musicians. The air was thick with tobacco smoke, the scent of manure, and the vapours of whiskey that wafted out of the town's public houses, and off the breath of those who celebrated a sale and a good price. Walter soon found a buyer for his cattle, and, as was tradition, the deal was sealed with a spit-filled handshake followed by a drink. As the day drew to a close, Walter Sly walked along Tullow Street towards Potato Market, where earlier he had hitched his horse, and perused the offerings of the various street traders who had set up stalls for the fair. He looked up from the suits of clothes that hung haphazardly on a rail, and across the road to where he first laid eyes upon the fair face of Lucinda Singleton, who was busy selling bread from her cart. Assisted by the spirits jostling around his stomach, he walked confidently in her direction and introduced himself. Walter and Lucinda spoke for some time. He told her of his lonely life on the farm in O'Loughlin, and Lucinda recounted the loss of her husband and the struggles of the last few years. Lucinda was taken with Walter, yet hesitant at the same time. While he was a man with land and money, she could also smell the whiskey on his breath, and she wondered to herself what trouble that may bring. The Carlow fair wound down for the evening, and Lucinda and Walter went their separate ways. Riding along the country lanes that would return him to O'Loughlin, Walter determined to make Lucinda his wife by any means necessary. He might even, for the first time in his adult life, stop drinking, although perhaps just for a while. The name Singleton rang a bell in Walter's mind. He recalled a young policeman by the same name who was working in the barracks in Bilbao, not far from his home, and wondered if he could be the estranged son Lucinda had mentioned, and if so, perhaps he could reunite mother and son and ingratiate himself with Lucinda. Walter's plans worked, and after a few months of courting Lucinda, she accepted his offer of marriage. She knew she couldn't continue alone on the farm for too much longer, and Walter had been on his best behaviour. She had not seen him take a drink since that first day at the fair, so surely, she hoped, her life was finally about to improve. Walter made a new will that left the farm to Lucinda in the event of his death, and also made her a promise that he would keep her own farm. Lucinda Singleton became Lucinda Sly and moved from her small holding in Tullow into Walter's larger home at the Ridge in Old Loughlin. Life at the Ridge with her new husband was not quite what Lucinda had hoped for. She had yearned for somebody to confide in, to hold her by the fire on long cold winter nights, to wake up next to in the morning, and most of all, to feel safe and secure. It soon became apparent, however, that Walter had yearned for little more than a cook, a cleaner, somebody to mend his clothes, and to do exactly what they were told. Lucinda spent her days running the household and helping on the farm, while Walter often travelled away from home to attend markets and patronise public houses. He was an ill-tempered man at the best of times, and now that he had a wife, he no longer felt the need to abstain from drinking, a habit that often turned his temper into a violent rage. Exactly when the beatings began, we do not know, but Lucinda soon found herself living in fear of her husband. As the years went on, Walter became increasingly violent. He attacked his wife with fists, belts, and horsewhips, leaving her body bruised and scarred. Lucinda often dreamt of returning to her farmhouse in Tullow, which Walter had promised to keep, but this hope of escape was quashed when she learned that he had sold the farm without her permission. She felt as though she were trapped in a nightmare she desperately wanted to escape, yet nobody seemed willing to help her. Lucinda turned to her church for assistance and appealed to Reverend John Doyne for help. She told Doyne that Walter was a man of the most violent temper, and how on one evening in particular he had turned her out of the house, forced her to stand naked in the rain, and then beat her with a horsewhip. Whether the Reverend Doyne ever broached the subject with Walter is unknown, but there was to be no respite for Lucinda. While working in the fields one day, Lucinda saw her neighbour, Bridget Massey, who lived with her husband a short distance from the Sly household. Lucinda confided in Bridget, as she had done many times before, and told her of how badly she was being treated. She loosened her clothing and lowered her blouse at the back to reveal the scars that had been left by the whip. On another occasion, while discussing the killing of a local man named Potts, Lucinda said to Bridget that bad luck to them that they did not kill Sly. For love, for money, or for God's sake, that man deserved to be killed. Sometime later, Lucinda called to Bridget's house early in the morning as she was looking for a girl to help her bring in some potatoes from the field. She saw a bottle of poison on a side table which Bridget's husband had bought to kill some rats, and asked if she could take it. Bridget refused her request and asked what she wanted it for, to which Lucinda replied, "The devil take me, but if I had it, I would give it to Watty." The agony of Lucinda's life was apparent to her neighbour, yet there was little she could do to help. Lucinda was effectively Walter's property, and he could treat her as he wished. At the time of their marriage, Walter had written a will that left all of his land and money, bar £10, to Lucinda, a will that he constantly threatened to change to leave her destitute. Life continued as usual in the Sly household until 1833, when a servant left unexpectedly, and Walter found himself unable to replace her. There were no suitable female servants available in the vicinity, and he was forced to hire a local man named John Dempsey. This was a rather unusual arrangement, as Dempsey, a Catholic farm labourer, would be required to work in the house under Lucinda's supervision, but perhaps Walter thought that due to the significant age gap that there was little chance of impropriety, and that Dempsey could act as both servant and labourer for one wage. John Dempsey was about 26 years old in 1833, some 30 years younger than Lucinda Sly. He was an experienced and hard-working farm labourer, a fact borne witness to by his broad shoulders and strong arms. Yet unlike Walter, who glared at his wife with contempt, he had a soft smile and a kindness in his eyes that Lucinda had not seen for a long time. A friendship developed between mistress and servant, as John became Lucinda's confidant and also her protector. When he was in the house during one of Walter's rages, John found that he was able to diffuse the situation by distracting and calming Walter down, thus preventing an attack on Lucinda. Over the following weeks, and despite their age gap, The friendship developed into a passionate and illicit affair, and for the first time since her marriage to Walter, Lucinda felt as though her life was not completely lost. At first, they were extremely careful to hide their relationship, as they knew the consequences of their affair being discovered would be cataclysmic. Walter was a large and domineering man, and had no fear of using violence, and was becoming increasingly paranoid. The 1830s were dangerous times in rural Ireland, particularly for Protestant landowners who evicted Catholic tenants. Walter was no aristocrat or absentee landlord by any means, but he did have a few tenants on his land, and in the early 1830s he evicted the Brennan family following a dispute over rent, an action that brought him to the attention of a secret agrarian society known as the Whitefeet. The group, mostly made up of poor rural men, sought to prevent evictions, rent raises and land grabs by using intimidation tactics against landlords. Walter's fears of reprisal by the Whitefeet or the Brennan family were realised when, on returning home to the farm one evening, he found that his favourite horse had been stabbed and killed. Realising his life had only been saved by the fact that he was not at home when the attack occurred, he began altering his route home to avoid any potential ambush, and he always kept his pistol close at hand. It was clear to Walter that the Whitefeet were uncomfortably close to home when the husband of the Sly's neighbour and Lucinda's confidant, Bridget Massey, was arrested and held in prison on suspicion of being a member of the secret society. Despite the danger of the situation, Lucinda and John started to become reckless, and several people witnessed what would later be described as a criminal intimacy between the lovers. Bridget Massey often saw Lucinda putting her hands around John's neck, and while visiting the Slys' home one day, she was shocked to witness the pair disappear into a room together, and Lucinda locked the door behind them. This was highly inappropriate behaviour between a married woman and her servant, and was further evidenced when John began referring to his employer as Lucy rather than address her as Mrs. Sly. John Dempsey could not always be around to intervene when Walter flew into one of his rages that inevitably ended in Lucinda being subjected to a violent assault, and it seemed like her son Thomas was willing to do little, if anything, to help. It's hard to believe that he wasn't aware of what was happening to his mother, yet he seemed to be on surprisingly good terms with Walter, as the pair often dined together at a public house next to Thomas's police barracks in Bilbao. Lucinda was living in fear of her life, as she believed it was only a matter of time before Walter killed her. She sometimes thought of murdering her abuser, but now that she had John, who despised Walter almost as much as she did, it seemed as though she might be able to pull it off. The couple dreamt of the life they could have together without Walter. Lucinda would inherit the farm upon his death, and they could live in O'Loughlin in peace, or even sell up and embark on a life together in America, far away from all their troubles. One evening, a local man named Michael Connors, who sometimes worked on the Sly's farm, called to the house, where he found Lucinda sitting alone by the fire. Her husband was out, and she beckoned him to sit with her for a while. Michael Connors was a poor man, his clothing was ragged, and Lucinda hoped he would be willing to do her a favour. Michael pulled a clay pipe from his pocket and put it to his lips, as Lucinda pleaded her case. "Mick, I have a thing on my breast which is burning me, and I don't know whether it is safe to tell you or not. And if you assist myself and my boy, you will be nothing the worse of it." Mick replied, "If it were anything that's good, tell me. If anything that's bad, keep it to you. This tyrant of a husband I have, if he have only a headache, is threatening to make another will, and there is one made this long time, which Mr. Phillips holds, and all his property is willed to me, except about £10 to his nephew Robert. He is going to Connacht one of these days for some horses, and if I could get him out of the way before he goes, it would be easier for me to hide money than horses. If you assist me and the boy, I will give you an acre of land, and a house rent-free while I live." "Oh Lord, woman, is it me to assist you in such a thing? If I had all the ground from where you sit to Carlow, I would not assist you." Michael, horrified by this request, made his excuses and left. Not long after his encounter with Lucinda, Michael Connors was sitting in his home when John Dempsey called to his door. He asked Michael to show him to the home of a farmer named Bill Murphy, and the two men walked together for a time until Michael could go no further, as his shoes were in such poor condition. "I don't pity you for having a bad coat and bad shoes when you won't do what Lucy desired of you," said John. Michael replied, "Go in God's name to some other farmer's house." "You are a fool, and it is a good deed to see you in hardship. I would not be more afraid of doing it myself than to cross that little drain. He never comes home, but he is stupidly drunk, and I need do no more than have a wattle or a fork handle, and give him a blow on getting off his horse. I am not without a pistol any hour I please. I would only have to knock him down and fire through his carcass." Despite John's bravado while berating Michael Connors, he was still not willing to carry out the deed himself. But this was all about to change in early November, when Michael saw Lucinda and John in a passionate embrace. Michael decided it was time that Walter was made aware of his wife's infidelity. He met Walter in his field and brought up the subject of John Dempsey. Walter told Michael how he did not like Dempsey and how his brother Archie and his mother felt very uneasy at his presence in the house, to which Michael replied, "I warn you on the same thing. This is the very business I had with you, and advise you in the name of God to turn Dempsey away. I saw friendship between your wife and the boy I don't like." On the morning of the 8th of November 1834, Walter Sly was in an even fouler mood than usual. The words of Michael Connors had kept him awake all night, and he knew that he would have to take action. He had to attend the fair in Carlow town that day, and as he was leaving, he made a chilling promise to his wife. "When I return, Lucinda Sly, I will make skillets of your skull." Lucinda had heard many threats like this before, but something in his tone seemed different this time. Walter glared menacingly at his wife before walking out the door, where he mounted his horse and left to spend the day in Carlow. Lucinda knew it was now or never. She was sure Walter intended to kill her that night, and when John arrived at the house, she told him of the threat and how he too was in mortal danger. The couple sat by the fireplace and together resolved to not let that happen. Walter Sly attended to his business at the fair in Carlow, and as was customary, indulged in a few drinks before leaving the town in the company of his friend Ned Radwell. The pair rode out together and soon encountered an acquaintance named Francis Campbell. Walter told Francis that he was heading to Bilbao to dine with Thomas Singleton, his stepson, at the police barracks. Francis could tell Walter had been drinking, but as it was fair day, she was hardly surprised. On reaching Bilbao, the group entered the public house instead of the barracks, where they were joined by Thomas Singleton, and Francis watched as the men ordered more drinks before she continued on her way home. By the time Walter returned to O'Loughlin, he was quite drunk and was feeling particularly belligerent. He pushed the door of the house open and immediately began hurling abuse at Lucinda. John stepped forward and put himself between husband and wife, and as he had done many times before, pacified the enraged farmer. Walter turned from his wife and took to his chair by the fireside, where he slumped into an alcohol-induced sleep. Lucinda took the hatchet that she had been keeping in a basket by the table and placed it into John Dempsey's hand. "Now is the time, John," she said, as she pushed him in the direction of her sleeping husband. He raised the hatchet over Walter's head, and there it lingered for several seconds before he drew back in fear. A second time, he raised his arm as Lucinda berated him for his cowardice. Yet again, he could not do it. Lucinda took the weapon from his hand in disgust. "I will do it myself," she said. She raised it over her husband's head, but at the last second, her courage evaporated and she shoved it back into John's hand. Once again, John approached the sleeping man. He channeled all the hatred he could, remembering the beatings Walter had inflicted on his Lucy. As he raised the weapon one more time, he swung his arm down with great force and cracked the skull of Walter Sly with the butt of the hatchet. Walter slumped down even further into the chair as John and Lucinda stared at his body. He did not move again. Lucinda took her husband's riding boots and coat and redressed Walter to give him the appearance of a man who had just returned home. John then carried him out into the yard and placed him by the stable door. He took a pistol from the house and, holding it at point-blank range from Walter's head, fired a shot through his skull. A shot so close that the flash singed the whiskers on Walter's face, and followed it with a second shot, this time hitting Walter's chest. Together they checked his pockets, where they found and took his wallet and silver watch, before John fired a third shot directly into the front door of the house. The pair retreated into the house, where they stayed for the rest of the night, and hoped they had done enough to convince the authorities that Walter had been the victim of either a violent robbery or had been murdered by the Whitefeet in retaliation for his eviction of the Brennan family. At 5 a.m. the next morning, a distraught Lucinda Sly ran across the fields to the house of her neighbour, Ben Stacey, and pleaded for his help. In an apparent state of panic, she told Ben that Walter had been murdered the night before and was lying dead in the yard. Lucinda recounted the evening's events to her neighbour as they made their way back to the house. She had heard Walter ride his horse past the front door and towards the stable at about 11 p.m. when she heard the first shot, followed by a thud as he hit the ground. A second shot was followed by a third that hit the door of the house as the assassins shouted to keep within. Afraid that she too would be shot, she dared not venture out of the house until morning, when she discovered her husband's body lying in a pool of his own blood. Ben Stacey was shocked by the sight of Walter's body, and he could not bring himself to approach it. He left the scene briefly to fetch another neighbour named John Griffin, and together the men searched Walter's body. Lucinda told them that Walter had his watch and wallet on him when he left for the fair, and when they could find neither, she exclaimed, "Oh Lord, is the watch gone?" News of the killing spread quickly throughout the neighbourhood, and soon reached the barracks in Bilbao, where Thomas Singleton was stationed. Thomas was likely the first policeman to reach the scene of the crime, where he found his distraught mother and his murdered stepfather. Reinforcements soon arrived from Carlow, and Captain Battersby took control of the investigation, relieving Thomas of his duties so he could look after his mother. As an inquest was organised, and Lucinda retold her story to the police, news reached the newspapers of the brutal murder, and the first article appeared that wasted no time in placing the blame on poor, vengeful Catholic farmers, while describing Walter as an industrious and unoffending Protestant farmer and a good neighbour. No cause can be assigned, except that a short time back he turned off his land persons of bad character, which is a step that no landlord now should, in this country, dare to resort to. However, rumours of an illicit affair between Lucinda and her servant boy spread throughout the county, and many believed that the case might not be so clear-cut. The following Monday morning, an inquest into the murder of Walter Sly began in the house at the ridge of Old Lachlan. Walter's body now lay on the kitchen table, and a rudimentary autopsy was performed by Coroner Edward Gorman Esquire, as jury members and neighbours crowded into the kitchen. The coroner inspected the head injury and the bullet wound, and surmised that if the blows to the head had not killed Walter, the bullet certainly had. He delicately managed to retrieve the ball that had been fired into his chest, so that it could be compared to the murder weapon, should it be found. Sub-Inspector Captain Battersby was a man of some experience, and he carefully watched the faces of Lucinda Sly and John Dempsey, whom he thought seemed more trepidatious than distraught. A search of the house was carried out, and a pair of breeches were discovered with what appeared to be splashes of blood. The breeches belonged to John Dempsey, but he anxiously explained that although the blood was Walter's, it had gotten on his clothing when he had protected him from an assault that had occurred in Lachlan Bridge. A locked box was next discovered, which it was believed contained Walter's pistol. Lucinda claimed that Walter always kept the key on his person, and that she had no access to the weapon. However, when the captain persisted, Lucinda was searched, and the key was found to be in her pocket. Battersby inserted his finger into the pistol, and found the gunpowder to be damp, a sure sign, he thought, that it had recently been fired. The coroner and the policeman listened carefully to the statements of the witnesses, who told of the unusual level of intimacy they had observed between Lucinda and John, and both became convinced that this was no sectarian killing or robbery, but was instead a crime of passion. The inquest continued late into Tuesday evening, when Captain Battersby finally placed Lucinda Sly and John Dempsey under arrest for the murder of Walter. He did, however, arrest 2 more people, John Brennan and William Johnston, whom he believed had also been conspiring to murder Walter for some time, and who were likely responsible for the stabbing of his horse some weeks previously. The suspects were placed in chains and taken to a cell in Carlow jail to await their trial. The prisoners would have to endure 4 long and anxious months in the dingy cells of the county jail before the commencement of the trial that would decide their mortal fate. Their love affair and alleged crime was now the talk of not just the county, but the entire country, and its illicit and scandalous nature was discussed from the grottiest public house to the finest of drawing rooms. A picture emerged in the minds of the public of an amoral seductress who betrayed her husband, her class, and her Protestant religion by seducing and inciting to murder a naive young Catholic boy. On Friday, the 27th of March, 1835, the public would have their first chance to catch a glimpse of the murderers as they gathered in a crowded courtroom in Carlow town for the commencement of the trial. The excited congregation spilled out into the streets surrounding the courthouse, now known as Dayton Hall, as a tremulous Lucinda Sly and John Dempsey waited in the holding cells below and listened fearfully to the chatter of the crowd above. The prisoners, on being placed at the bar, were greatly agitated for a few moments. Dempsey appeared to be a smart, well-dressed young man, about 30 years of age, of rather mild aspect. The female prisoner, the wife of the deceased, Walter Sly, was about 56 years of age, and on being arraigned, trembled excessively. Both were charged with having conspired, aided, and assisted in the murder of Walter Sly at the ridge of Old Lachlan on the morning of the 9th of November last. During the reading of the indictment, which contained 8 counts, the prisoners stood unmoved and pleaded not guilty. Mr. Martley, KC, stated the case. He observed that as the evidence was circumstantial, it was unnecessary to do more than state a few facts and leave it to the jury. He hoped that the jury would banish from their minds all rumours respecting the murder and hear the case, and decide according to the evidence laid before them. One of the prisoners, Lucinda Sly, was married and had issue by a first husband, but none by the deceased, Walter Sly. He lamented to say that the second marriage was not very fortunate, as they lived together most unhappily, which led to the unfortunate event they had to inquire into. About a year before the death of Sly, he employed a servant, the other prisoner at the bar, and he regretted to say it would appear from evidence that criminal intimacies took place between them, disgraceful to a mistress of a house, not taking into consideration that she was a married woman, and this criminal intercourse was the principal cause of the murder. Mr. Martley entered into a lengthened detail of the manner in which the crime was committed, and the nature of the conspiracy entered into between the prisoners to commit the murder, and concluded a very able and eloquent statement amid deep silence, the court being crowded to excess. A series of witnesses were called to give evidence, most of whom were the neighbours of the ill-fated Slys in Old Lachlan, and although the public listened silently and intently as they spoke, a great ripple of excitement and sensation was periodically heard in the court, as witness after witness recounted the scandalous and criminal displays of affection they had seen take place between Lucinda and John. Among the witnesses were Francis Campbell, who had travelled with Walter after leaving the fair in Carlow on the night of his murder, who told the court how Walter had spoken to her of his fear of being murdered by the Brennans. Reverend John Doyne spoke of how Lucinda had come to him to complain of the violent treatment she had received at the hands of her husband. Robert Phillips, Esquire, the executor of Walter's will, and also a neighbour, told of how Lucinda had lied to him about the key to the pistol box, saying that Walter had taken it with him, when in truth it was discovered on her person, and when the pistol was examined, it clearly had been recently fired. Sergeant Shane gave evidence that during a search of the Sly house, he had discovered a pair of white corduroy breeches stashed between the board of the bedstead and the straw that appeared to be covered in spatters of red. The breeches were shown to the jury, who agreed that the marks were indeed blood. Bridget Massey spoke of the intimacy she had witnessed between Lucinda and John, and of Lucinda's stories of frequent abuse, and her request to take the bottle of poison from her house that she wished to use on her husband. When it came to John Dempsey's involvement in concealing the crime, the evidence of Catherine Landrican proved to be damning. Catherine knew Walter and visited the house on the Sunday morning following his death. There was little food in the house that morning, and Catherine went out with John to take in some potatoes from the field. On the way there, John ran ahead of Catherine, jumped over a stile, and disappeared out of view in the haggard. She called out to John. He answered, "Here, Kitty," and she followed his voice to where she found him hurriedly pulling his hand out of a stack of corn. The following day, Sub-Constable Joseph Flanagan was ordered to carry out a search of the haggard, where he discovered Walter's silver watch in the very stack of corn John had been seen putting his hand into. Captain Battersby, who was standing nearby, recalled how the colour had drained out of John's face when he saw the watch. Michael Connors also took to the stand and told the court of Lucinda's request to murder her husband, and of the reward of a house and land that she had offered. By the time the last witness had spoken, it was almost midnight, and the members of the jury were finally asked to withdraw to consider their verdict. After a short deliberation, they returned to the court at 10 minutes to 12 and declared that Lucinda Sly and John Dempsey were guilty of murder. Nothing could equal the awful solemnity of the scene. At the hour of midnight, the court crowded to excess, and the intense anxiety of the assembly. The Chief Justice himself was greatly affected, and for a few moments after the delivery of the verdict, he held his handkerchief to his face, apparently greatly affected. He sat from nearly 10 o'clock in the morning to that hour and seemed much exhausted. On putting on the black cap, the court presented a deadly silence. The prisoners appeared unmoved. Dempsey in particular, who cried out in a very firm tone of voice, "For a long day." The Chief Justice then pronounced judgment in a very impressive manner and concluded by ordering them for execution on Monday next. Dempsey received his sentence without the slightest emotion, while the unfortunate woman sank into a corner of the dock in a state of insensibility. We have witnessed many such scenes in a court of justice, but never beheld any that appeared to make so deep an impression upon all present as that which closed the mortal career of this hapless woman, Mrs. Sly. The Chief Justice, who was much exhausted, retired at 12:30 o'clock at night. The convicted murderers were taken to the county jail to await their hanging, that was scheduled to take place 2 days later at 2:30 p.m. John Dempsey, realising that his fate was sealed, confessed to his crimes in a desperate bid to save his soul from eternal damnation. He admitted that he was the one who killed Walter, but he had only done it at the request of his Lucy. Lucinda, on the other hand, made no such confession and maintained her innocence to the end. John, perhaps in a state of denial, became almost deliriously happy once his confession had been taken, and spent many hours in prayer to prepare himself for what was to come. The crowds gathered outside Carlow jail early on the morning of Monday, the 30th of March 1835. Eager for a day's free entertainment, they pushed forward as far as they could to gain the best view of the now notorious Lucinda Sly, and numbered approximately 10,000. At times they jeered the convicts, Lucinda in particular, and were most anxious for the execution to take place. The following is an eyewitness account of the events of the day. On Monday last, the above unfortunate persons underwent the extreme penalties of the law in front of the county jail, pursuant to the sentence passed on them for the willful murder of Walter Sly. Dempsey was perfectly resigned to his fate, acknowledged the justice of his sentence, and made a full confession of his murder, and that he was instigated to commit the foul deed by Mrs. Sly. His conduct before his execution was almost exemplary, and to some gentlemen who visited him in his cell about 12 o'clock, he declared that he would not change his position then for any earthly consideration, that he was certain of a pardon for his offences through the blood of Christ, and that he was never so happy since he attained the age of reason, and that as Christ pardoned the penitent thief, so he expected mercy through the all-sufficient atonement of his Redeemer. When his sister visited him, he preserved his usual calmness and took his leave of her with the greatest firmness, telling her at the same time that instead of being sorrowful, she should rejoice at his fate and his certain prospects of eternal happiness. He was attended by the Roman Catholic clergy of the parish, the Reverend Messrs. Hume and Duggan. Mrs. Sly appeared also perfectly resigned, and was attended by the Reverend Messrs. Hare and Blood, who continued in prayer with her in her cell until she was led forth for execution. They remained with her on the scaffold to the last. Dempsey, on being visited by Captain Battersby, warmly shook him by the hand and acknowledged his gratitude to him for his attention, kindness and strict justice throughout the entire proceedings. The open space in front of the jail and the fields opposite were crowded from a very early hour by an immense concourse of people. A party of the 1st Royal Dragoons and a body of the police were drawn up in front of the jail. At 2:30 p.m, the culprits were led from their cells. Dempsey walked with a firm step to the platform, but changed colour on seeing the crowd. Mrs. Sly appeared perfectly unconscious of what was happening, and was so weak as to be under the necessity of being carried up the stairs into the press room. Dempsey made a motion with his hands as if to address the crowd, but from weakness was unable to proceed. Both were launched off together and died within a few seconds without a struggle. After hanging the usual time, the bodies were taken down and interred in the rear of the jail infirmary. Dempsey was 27 years of age and Mrs. Sly was about 60. The newspapers reported that the two convicts died within a few seconds. Exactly how true this was is debatable, as death by hanging at this time was still a haphazard form of execution. Those condemned to death prayed that their neck would snap and that death would be instantaneous. Many unfortunate convicts were not so lucky and slowly asphyxiated at the end of the rope. Perhaps the execution was not as efficient as reported, or perhaps the behaviour of the crowd was deemed to be too morbid and grotesque, but either way, on that day in 1835, Lucinda Sly went down in history as the last woman to ever be publicly hanged in the county of Carlow. It is worth noting that one of the members of the jury was another Carlow man named Samuel Houghton, who, greatly affected by executions such as the one he witnessed that day, went on to create a mathematical equation that would allow executioners to accurately calculate the length of rope that would ensure the breaking of the convict's neck based on their weight, and thus provide a more humane death. Lucinda and John were buried behind the infirmary that stood within the grounds of Carlow Jail. After the jail closed down, it became an engineering works and was subsequently converted to a shopping centre that opened in 1994. There are stories of bodies being found over the years as foundations for machinery were installed in the works. Comparing a map from the 1830s to this modern aerial view, we can see that their graves were likely located close to the access road for the car park or beneath the shopping centre itself. Lucinda and John's story could have ended so differently if not for their reckless public displays of affection and their failure to dispose of the key to the pistol box and Walter's silver watch, which they had ample opportunity to do between the time of the murder, thought to be about 11 p.m. on the 8th of November, and 5 a.m. the next morning when Lucinda ran to Ben Stacey's house. Their failures on each account led them to the hangman's noose and the scaffold, the remains of which we can still see today above the front door of Carlow Shopping Centre.